In your job, you've got two types of soldered fitting. You've got this one, which is an integral soldering fitting, and right inside there is, you can see on the bump, there's a solder preloaded with solder. Because it's preloaded with solder, we don't need to put any additional solder in, or we shouldn't have to. The only problem with these joints is they're great, and they obviously you don't have to feed solder in, so it makes it easier, but they're about 4 times the price of these, which are solderless. These have no solder in, these are end feed. So we've got to get solder, and we've got to feed that solder in to the end, and by the action of capillarity, it'll draw it into the fitting. However, when you do solder any fitting, there's some little regimes you've got to follow. Cleanliness is the first one. Even though this pipe looks clean, it's not clean, it's actually oxidized. I'm just going to get a little bit of wire wool. If I clean the end of this pipe, you'll see the difference that the oxidation makes. So that's a clean pipe. That side is oxidized. And that oxidation is impurities, and the solder will not readily adhere to those impure surfaces. However, with modern fluxes, with this stuff, these are an acid-based flux. And because they're acid-based, they do the same job that I've just done with that wire wool. As they're heated up, they're also taking the impurities off the surface. It's not a problem, though, to clean a pipe as well as using the flux. The cleaner, the better. And the other thing you have to remember is that when you're soldering, as soon as you've cleaned a pipe, it's exposed to the air and it's starting to oxidize again. And so as soon as you cleaned it, you need to flux it. Well, I'm not quite ready to solder yet. I'm going to show you how to do the two joints. This is an end feed, and this is an end feed reducer from 22 millimeters to 15, and this is our solder ring fitting. In order for us to solder these, whenever you're doing soldering, you must make sure that all pieces of the pipe are in each end of the fitting, so you don't solder one end and then the other. And also, if you've got an insert, the insert is effectively another pipe, so you've got to clean that as well. So that needs to be cleaned, the inside of that needs to be cleaned, the inside of that needs to be cleaned, and the inside of that needs to be cleaned. And then it needs pipe in there and pipe in there, both of which need to be cleaned on the outside, okay? It's all about the cleaning. So I'm going to prepare this for soldering. We'll prepare all the joints that we need, so I just need a few offcuts of pipe. Get your flux, and get your flux brush. Remember, it's an acid-based flux. Never use your fingers. Always wear gloves when you're soldering. I don't necessarily have to clean this pipe because that flux will do the job, but I'll give it a light clean with wire wool as well. It never does any harm. I'm going to get my flux. Just get enough on the brush so that it just goes the depth of the fitting. You don't want the flux all over the pipe, because all this is doing is cleaning the pipe, and it's going to help the pipe when it's heated up to run the solder. Well, that's our pipe. We're going to have a 15 mil bit in the other end, so I'm going to clean the end of that pipe, and I'm going to put some flux on that one, just the depth of the flux brush. That's the two pipes. And then we need to clean our fittings. Well, we're going to put a straight connector on. And these do normally need a little scour around the inside, so just stick your thumb in with your wire wool. Make sure you're wearing gloves, otherwise you're going to end up with splinters of wire wool in your skin and it'll become infected. And then flux the inside. And make sure it's just the inside, not all over the outside of the fitting. So that's one ready. Put it straight on its pipe so it doesn't oxidize. And then we need to do the outside of that one. So we'll just roll that round. And we're going to do outside of that one I'm going to pop it straight in its fitting so it doesn't oxidize, and then we'll clean the inside of that one. A little bit of flux. And then the one that we did on the outside goes into there. That's now ready to solder. We've got all the surfaces cleaned inside and out, and we've got it loaded with both pieces of pipe, our 15mm and our 22. You should never solder like that, or I'll solder that end and then put that end in. Because what happens is, when you come back to solder that end, it's going to melt the solder in this end and break the joint. So always make sure it's preloaded with solder. Then you need to find somewhere suitable to solder. You can solder straight onto heat mats like this, but you need to raise the pipe up to do it. So we'll just get some spare bits of pipe. Just so you've got, so that it's got room to run all the way around. The only problem with doing this is that it'll tend to roll about or move when you're using the solder. So we might want to get a bit of weight as well. So I'm just going to use a heavy weight just to trap the pipe so that it doesn't move when I'm soldering it. And actually, something on the other side. Otherwise, when you come to put the solder on, the pipe will tend to want to move around. The other alternative is to solder it over the end of a bench, but on a straight piece like that. It's not ideal, so we're going to solder it over a heat mat. Remember, heat mats are designed to protect customers' property, and you should always use heat mats if you're near to a surface, whether it's a wall or a skirting board. Otherwise, you're going to leave scorch marks on the customer's property. Always remember to clean your flux brush off when you're finished, otherwise the acid in it will continue to attack the aluminium in the brush. And we're going to need a bit of solder. We don't need much. This is just a bit left on a reel here, so I'm going to use that up. And you need a bit of flux on your solder as well. Always have a bit of flux on the solder as well. In fact, I'm going to take this off the reel. And just before you start to solder, because it's the flux that's really doing the cleaning, just put a little run of flux onto there. So we're now ready to solder. Move everything out of the way, get rid of that. Keep your flux pot handy, because if you need to add more flux to continue the cleaning process when you start to heat, you can do. So we're going to use a blowtorch to make the soldered joint. This is a blowtorch with an integral bottle. If you're using one with a hose and a gun, it's exactly the same. But you need, on this one, to open the gas tap at the back. Make sure that that is shut before you start. Make sure that you've put leak detector fluid around the gun and the bottle to make sure there's no leaks, and open up the gas tap. And then it's got a safety trigger, which should be like that before you start. Take it off its safety to the on position, and it's got an auto igniter, so as soon as I light it up, the flames are there. Then lock it off. Okay, whilst you've got it stood on the bench, adjust your flame. Now we've got two diameters of pipe here, 22 and 15. 22 needs a little bit more heat than 15. So I would start at the 22mm end, because by the time that's got enough heat into the pipe, it'll also have enough heat for the 15mm. So I'm going to set it so we've got a little king's crown, and you can see just the tips of a king's crown around the flame. And remember, the hottest part of the flame is in the cone at the top. You'll see a little inner cone, and at the top of the cone it's at about 500 degrees Celsius, and that's where you want the heat. So I'm ready to solder. Don't light your gun until you are ready to solder, and don't turn around talking to people with it in your hand. You want the gun over the fitting. You're not heating anything other than the fitting and the pipe. You're not dripping the solder in, you're using the heat from the pipe to cause the solder to run. So get your heat over the fitting and just move it around until you see the flux start to run, and just try your solder. And your solder will tell you when it's ready for the joint. There we are, it's just starting run, that's fine. Go on to the next one, that's fine. Go on to the next one, that's fine. And you need to do it in one movement like that. First, second, third, because once the heat's in there, if I continue to apply heat, all that's going to happen is it's going to get heavily oxidated again, and we'll have to stop and start again. Next thing you do is nothing. You stand and let it cool. Stand your gas bottle up, move it into a safe place, make sure the nozzle is out the way of people, turn the gas tap off, let that cool down for at least 1 minute on its own. And then you're going to wipe off any excess flux using a damp cloth. Don't be tempted to use the damp cloth to cool it down, because if you do, you will shrink the solder and again you'll break the joint. So you have to have a little bit of patience, just for a minute, just till it's enough time for the solder to have set. Once it's set, then you can clean off the joint. But again, there'll still be some heat in this, so make sure you're at the other end of the pipe, because with conduction, it'll still be hot. Get your damp cloth and give it a very good wipe over with a damp cloth. Make sure that it's nice and clean. Take any residue flux off. Just check it hasn't moved out as straight, just moved out as straight slightly. And then check, inspect the joints. Well, there's a little bit too much solder on that one, so we're going to take that bit of solder off. And I'm not 100% happy with that one. So the main thing with soldering, you'll always get a second chance at it, but you have to clean it between processes. So I'm now going to take that little solder dot off, and I'm going to get just a touch more into that joint there. I'm happy with that one, doesn't need any more solder. So again, just going to light it up, open the gas tap, light it, set the flame. This time I don't want too much heat in it, because I don't want to start resoldering the other joint. So I'm just going to make our King's crown a little bit smaller, a little Queen's crown this one. And I'm going to take that solder dot off first. You'll see it's just a case of melting it, and I can use my flux brush just to help. Once it's melted, that's it. That was just because there's just a little bit of excess solder, and then I want a little bit more in this joint, so a little bit of flux on my solder, and I'm just going to put a little bit more into that side. That's enough, don't go mad with the solder, and that'll do. We'll let that cool down, and that should be a watertight joint right round. Obviously, soldering is exactly the same as bending. It requires practice, and the more practice you have, the cleaner the joints get, and the neater they get. But you must never be tempted to, oh, I'll put a bit more in, I'll put a bit more in. Too much solder just overloads the fitting, and you end up with excessive solder on the pipework. Not enough solder means you'll end up with no watertight joint. It won't have ran all the way around. And so if you want to get rid of some excess solder, that's fine. But remember, lower the heat, otherwise you're going to start and resolder the joints you've just done. And patience. 1 minute of cooling at least to cool on its own. And then a damp cloth, make sure it is a damp cloth with some water on it. And make sure you clean all that residue off. And when you have done that, you should be left with a clean pipe joint.